So welcome everybody to the third edition of the Spaceport SARABHAI Space Law and Policy Dialogue series. We are delighted to host this session in collaboration with the Australian Space Agency. The focus for today's discussion will be the legal compass for lunar exploration. We have a very distinguished panel with us today from India and from Australia. I would like to invite our panelists now. Dr. Ranjana Kaul, welcome. So Ranjana is the member of the board of the International Institute of Space Law, and she's the Secretary General of Spaceport SARABHAI, India's independent space think tank that was launched last autumn. I'd like to next welcome Professor Stephen Freeland. Stephen is Emeritus Professor of International Law at the Western Sydney University. He is also the Vice Chair at the United Nations Scopus Working Group for legal aspects of space resources activities. Our next panelist is Dr. Aude Vignelles. She is the Chief Technology Officer for the Australian Space Agency. And we have our youngest panelist today is a brilliant independent space writer from India, Jatan Mehta. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
So what we'll do is we will start by taking a look at the lunar exploration roadmaps for Australia and India. I'd like to start with you, Aude. Could you tell us a bit more about Australia's plans for moon exploration in the context of the Artemis project, which now Australia has signed up for, and also in an international context, so collaboration with other countries such as India in particular, because the head of your agency, Mr. Enrico Palermo, visited India in September with a large delegation of Australian companies. Over to you, Aude.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. As you rightly said, so we were one of the first countries to sign the Artemis Accords, and we started very early with the Moon to Mars initiatives, so lots of projects under these programs. And today, when we look at all the projects and programs which have now almost reached completion, we can see that we have developed a lot of capabilities and technologies in different areas and different level of maturity as well, TRL 3, TRL 9, and that can support the lunar exploration and the Moon to Mars. You can also see that in Canberra, we are hosting the Canberra Deep Space Communication Complex. So we are already supporting the Artemis mission, and the Artemis 1 will be followed by this complex from launch till splashdown. So we are already ready to support operationally the exploration and whatever this Moon to Mars initiative brings us to. So we are very proud to support these capabilities and technologies. What I would like also to add is there are 21 signatories of the Artemis program, so it is an international cooperation. We have signed a lot of MOUs with different agencies. We have signed one with ISRO in February 2021, where we highlighted several areas where we could cooperate together. And yes, when our heads, Dr. Enrico Palermo, visited India, he came with one of the biggest delegation we visited overseas. And so that shows that there is a great will from both countries to work together. I believe 7 MOUs have been signed between Australian and Indian companies. I won't list them all, but I invite the audience to look at the details because they are very promising companies on both sides. So there is already a lot of commercial agreements between both countries to do things together. And we are also working with ISRO to look into how to support the Gaganyaan missions, and we are very, very excited about that.
Thank you, Aude. So for the benefit of our audience, those of you who are not familiar with the Artemis program, let me tell you that the Artemis program is a US-led initiative for a return to the moon. And the US government has signed several bilateral agreements with other governments that are interested in being a part of the Artemis program. And these bilateral agreements is what we are referring to as the Artemis Accords. Regarding the Gaganyaan program, which Aude mentioned, that is the Indian Space Research Organization-led initiative in India to launch humans into low Earth orbit, hopefully in the next year or two. And with that, I think I will direct my next question to Jatan. Jatan, could you give us an overview of India's lunar exploration missions, past, present, and the near future? And also, if I may, could you compare and contrast them with our neighbors, Asian neighbors, China and Japan in particular?
Yes. So hi, thank you very much for having me here. So India's planetary exploration program started with Chandrayaan-1, and as did the lunar exploration program as a result. And at this point, everyone is familiar with the discovery of lunar water with Chandrayaan-1. So that was a pretty nice thing to do. And that's ultimately what at least catalyzed Artemis to happen. So that's interesting. And that's something nice. So Chandrayaan-1 was directly followed by Chandrayaan-2 in the lunar exploration context by ISRO, where we had a lander, a rover, and an orbiter. However, as we all know, that unfortunately the lander seems to have crashed, and therefore the landing part of the mission has failed, and the rover was lost along with it. But the orbiter is still going on, and it's something that most people tend to forget. So we should be keeping our eyes locked on that, because there's a whole stream of science coming out from the orbiter. So the Chandrayaan-2 orbiter has, for example, one of the most advanced radars that has ever flown on any lunar mission, and that includes LRO. And LRO folks are actively partnering with ISRO on the radar. So just an example to show, the kind of science that the Chandrayaan-2 orbiter is helping bring out. So we have the Chandrayaan-2 orbiter active right now, and it's expected to go to have fuel required for the correction maneuvers until about 5 years from now, approximately. So we should be good till then. In the meanwhile, ISRO has started preparing for Chandrayaan-3, which is essentially a repeat of the surface mission of Chandrayaan-2. So it will have more or less the same lander, but obviously with upgrades so that we can ensure that the landing sticks around this time. And there is much optimism among all the ISRO folks working on the mission, because now we have even more strengthened legs, better sensors, better communications equipment, and so on. So Chandrayaan-3 is targeting an early 2023 launch at the moment. And the final series of tests are ongoing on the lander, specifically on the landing and the structural side. So that's ongoing. So I'm very excited about Chandrayaan-3, and I think it will be a big deal when the mission launches and hopefully lands this time around. That'll be very exciting. The rover is also going to do a lot of science in it. For just to give the most the best example from the rover science is it has a couple of spectrometers wherein the near polar region where it would be exploring, it can tell you the composition of the lunar crust, which is something we don't have a lot of information about. We do know some things about it, but not a lot. So this will add to that knowledge. Then the next mission that we have in our lunar exploration portfolio is LUPEX, which is a collaboration with the Japanese Space Agency. And that's a very interesting one because we are providing the lander, the Japanese are providing the rover, as well as the launch vehicle. So the mission would see a launch around 2025 at the moment, although I must add here that it's not yet a government approved mission, but it's getting there. So notionally, it will launch around 2025, land on the moon near the polar region, like 89 degrees south or something like that, with an ISRO provided lander, and then the Japanese rover will explore the moon for several weeks. Including surviving lunar nights. And it's very challenging because in terms of technical challenges, which you can read about more on the web, it is very comparable to the NASA's Viper mission of 2024, both of which have a similar goal to characterize the nature of water ice on the lunar poles, which ultimately is the key to doing anything sustainable on the moon, and key to everything that we would talk about today. So now switching over to the second question that Susmita asked is comparing it to the Chinese and Japanese exploration plans with regards to the moon. So comparing to China, I think there would be nearly no common ground, because while we did both China and India did send their first orbiters in the early 2000s. That is true, but China has taken a much more focused and um, focused and much better funded approach to lunar exploration. For them, it's a national priority, much like how Gaganyaan is a national priority for India. So China has already done 3 soft landings so far, and that too in a century where so far no other country has been able to do so. So that just shows the kind of focus they are putting into the mission, into the program, to in my perspective. And also they have done a sample return mission so far, which is also unique, which was the first sample return in in a long time. And now they are gearing up to another sample return mission and resource mapping missions for the poles, because they aim to build a robotic scientific base and eventually have humans, although that is not been approved formally by the government yet, but much work is ongoing. So there's no comparison there. But in terms of the Japanese ones, Japanese are also trying to do a soft landing mission in 2023, which is a precision lander. So what it basically means is that they want to land with a 100-meter landing precision, which is necessary for polar missions, and that would be necessary for all Artemis missions or as well in the future. And going ahead, we are going to partner with NASA for the Artemis programs and missions.
Yeah, thanks, Jatan. And I think, like you said, China is the only country to have landed on the moon in recent years. So between 2013 and 2020, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Jatan, but China has landed 3 times successfully, consecutively on the moon. And the last mission, they did bring back lunar samples, which is a first in 40 years, because the last human landing that the US did was in 1972. And the last robotic landing that Russia did was in 1976. And I think with that, we will shift gears a little bit. We will now look at the legal aspects and regulatory aspects with the moon exploration plans that the world has. So Stephen, I would like to have you tell us or explain to our audience and all of us here, from what I have read, we have 21 countries which are now signatories to the Artemis Accords. And there is the 1979 Moon Agreement, which seems to have been a little unpopular because we have only a handful of countries that signed it. And some of them did ratify it, some of them didn't. So perhaps you could demystify the Moon Agreement for us all in the context of the Artemis Accords, and also in the context of Australia and India, if I may.
Thank you, Susmita, and thank you so much to Spaceport SARABHAI for giving me the opportunity to participate in this fantastic event. I'm really grateful. Thank you, Susmita, for raising a treaty that is near and dear to the heart of every Australian. So yes, there are 5 United Nations treaties, 5 core treaties about space. And the last one of those is the 1979 Moon Agreement. So what happened, now, as you know, a lot of the discussion is the excitement about the possibility of exploiting resources on the lunar surface and other celestial bodies. That excitement already existed in the 1970s based on an analysis of the lunar samples that the Apollo missions brought back. And during the course of the 1970s, culminating in 1979, the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space agreed the terms of a treaty, which we call the Moon Agreement. And the raison d'etre of that treaty is the notion that at some point, what we call exploitation of the resources on celestial bodies will become feasible at some point. And at that point, the parties to the treaty would get together and agree what they believe would be an appropriate regime to govern that exploitation. But in the meantime, the Moon Agreement gives the states parties already, it's a very enabling treaty, gives the states parties the legal right to samples, the legal right to exploit in a smaller way, to utilize resources on celestial bodies, let's say the moon for the purposes of today's discussion, to support their scientific mission. And so the Moon Agreement allows the 18 states parties, gives them rights and enables them to do certain things where it could not be argued that they would be in breach of international law by doing so. Now, for various political reasons, even though the terms of the Moon Agreement were agreed by consensus at Copos and then made open for parties to sign and or ratify, and as I said, Australia is a state party, it's ratified. India is a signatory to the Moon Agreement. It hasn't ratified, but by being a signatory, it signaled its interest in the treaty, and it also is under an obligation not to do anything to defeat the object and purpose of the treaty. So India itself has obligations not to be bound by the terms, but in terms of in good faith supporting the Moon Agreement. And so the 18 states parties have rights, and for them it's a really important treaty. It's part of their international law rights and obligations. But for various political reasons, none of the, if I may use the expression, major spacefaring nations, and by that I mean the United States and China and Russia, have either signed or ratified. Now that's really for internal political reasons as much as anything. And therefore people say, well, the Moon Agreement, it's a failed treaty, it's, as you said, unpopular, but it still represents law, and it's still an important treaty as far as those 18 states parties, and as I said, the 4 signatories. So the Artemis Accords that you mentioned have then been put together as a political non-binding arrangement between now 21 agencies around the world. And it is looking at issues which include, but go beyond, the notion of exploitation of resources. And it is about trying to put together principles of cooperation that enhance safety, but are centered around the Outer Space Treaty and everything that the Outer Space Treaty involves. And so the 2 arrangements, the binding treaty, the Moon Agreement, which binds 18 countries, and the non-binding but politically binding, if you like, Artemis Accords, both overlap in terms of some of the things they look at. But all of it is designed around notions that stem from the Outer Space Treaty, which is peaceful uses of exploration and use on celestial bodies, of doing things in cooperation and doing things for benefits of the broader community. And so, you know, they are both important inputs to a broader discussion, which we'll get onto a bit later, about how we move forward with particular activities on the moon and then ultimately other celestial bodies. So I hope that helps to, if you like, demystify the Moon Agreement. It's part of international law. It has a lot of positive, interesting provisions about the environment, about intergenerational equity, about what the parties can do and the possibilities in the future if exploitation on a significant level becomes feasible.
So Stephen, as a follow-up question, some of us have heard that there are certain concerns around conflict of interest if a country is participating in the Artemis program, has signed the accords, and is also a ratifying state, as in the case of Australia. Could you explain the legal position regarding possibility of a conflict of interest and sketch out some scenarios for us?
Yes, that's a really interesting question because, as I said just now, the Moon Agreement and the Artemis Accords deal in some parts with similar types of activities or potential activities. The Artemis Accords in section 11 talks specifically about the notion of future exploitation and use of resources. Now, as I said, one of them is a binding arrangement, a binding treaty amongst 18 parties. The other is a non-binding political agreement between 21 agencies. First point. Second point is, of course, a lot of academics have jumped up and down and said, how dare Australia be a party to the Moon Agreement and also sign Artemis? You know, outrageous. There's massive conflict between the two. Well, let me make a couple of points. Firstly, Australia is not the only country that is involved in both of those arrangements. So Australia, Mexico, and Saudi Arabia are all parties to the Moon Agreement, also signatories to Artemis. And I'm aware of at least one other party to the Moon Agreement that is very close to becoming also a signatory of Artemis. So you already have 3 Moon Agreement parties that have decided, you know, they've analyzed the situation and decided that being a signatory to Artemis is not in any way inconsistent with their rights and their obligations under the Moon Agreement. Point number 2. Point number 3 is the way international law works. It's not what I as an academic would say, how dare they do this, but it's what do the other states parties say? And we've had absolutely no protests, no negative comments at all from any of the Moon Agreement, other states parties to the Moon Agreement, saying how dare Australia or how dare Mexico or how dare Saudi Arabia do this? You know, you're in breach of your obligations under the Moon Agreement. Nobody has said that. And so, and Australia, and no doubt Mexico and Saudi Arabia will as well, but Australia has on numerous occasions made it absolutely clear that they have analyzed the situation, and from their perspective, the 2 arrangements coexist without conflict. And so the fact that some academics say, you know, one is about peaceful uses, and then they speculate that the Artemis Accords are really a disguise for something beyond peaceful. I mean, that's just academics doing what academics do. And I'm an academic myself, so, you know, our job is to try to provoke and raise speculation, but that's not the way international law works. The current situation is the 3 countries who are involved in both arrangements are absolutely perfectly comfortable that there is no conflict between those 2, and in fact, they coexist. Nobody else, no other state party, no other country has protested or even raised the possibility that this is a conflict. And so for all intents and purposes, they can coexist. And as I said, it's highly likely that more states parties to the Moon Agreement will also join Artemis. Of course, in the end, as we move forward to find rules of the road going forward in more specific detail about possible lunar activities with resources, then we'll have to work out what inputs can come from both of those instruments, the Moon Agreement, the Artemis Accords, into a final, if you like, agreed package of rules of the road. But at the moment, despite what some people will say, there is no conflict, and certainly no conflict in the mind's eye of the actors for whom this is a relevant question. Rather than people speculating about issues that perhaps are more on the academic side than on the practical and real politics side. So I hope that dispels the arguments once and for all that, you know, that Australia or Saudi Arabia or Mexico are in some way in breach of their obligations. For all intents and purposes, they are not. Nobody says they are. They have made it clear that they believe everything coexists, and so we just move forward in that regard. Thanks, Esme.
Thanks, Stephen. So if I were to extend or extrapolate the question to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which is not particularly focused on the moon, but looks at space as a shared resource for humanity, would you say that it's similar, as if there wouldn't be a real conflict of interest between that treaty and the Artemis Accords?
Well, the Artemis Accords parties, and I know others can speak to this as well, the Artemis Accords specifically refers to the Outer Space Treaty and says that everything is centered around and in compliance with the Outer Space Treaty. That's the view of the Artemis signatories. And indeed, nothing in the Artemis Accords, I mean, of course, you can always raise arguments, but all of the signatories have said, whatever we do, we are trying to operationalize the Outer Space Treaty. Now, it is true that the Artemis Accords raises some issues that are not specifically covered in the Outer Space Treaty, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily inconsistent with it. So the Artemis signatories have made it clear they are all parties to the Outer Space Treaty, 111 countries are, and that they have made it clear that in the way they move forward as between themselves under these political arrangements, they will in every way, shape and form seek to comply with the Outer Space Treaty. So again, obviously that has to be done, but the Artemis signatories have made it clear that the Outer Space Treaty is the centrality upon which and everything is based as we move forward.
Okay, I think that settles the question for now. We will go back to the technology lens for a bit again. And this question is a common question both for Aude and Jatan. So other than the usual orbiter, lander, rover, and sample return formula that any country that wants to engage in exploring and utilizing the moon follows, I would want you guys to tell us a bit more about what kind of technologies do you think the moon will allow us to use, to test, and prepare for future journeys to, Mars and beyond. Aude, maybe you could start, and then Jatan, you could also take the same question.
Thanks for a very good question, especially for an agency as young as we are. I mean, we are just over 4 years old. So if you recall, when we were created, the first thing we did was to publish a civil space strategy. And in that strategy, we highlighted 7 areas of priorities. Priorities because we need these technologies for Australia day-to-day function, but also because we have competitive advantage or comparative advantage in that technologies. So they were Earth observation, communication, PNT, space situational awareness, remote operations and robotics, access to space, and I always forget one, and that will come back to me. Oh, and we have a bucket called R&D because we always discover new niche technology in Australia, and there is the first technology and capability that came out of that leapfrog R&D bucket is the applied space medicine and life science. So looking at these areas of priorities and the project that we are undertaking under each of these priority, we realize that when we look at this with an Artemis lens, thinking Artemis mission architecture or Artemis objectives. So when I mean by architecture, I mean Earth segment, space segment, surface segment, lunar segment. And when you look at the objective of Moon to Mars that we actually worked on the 21 signatories at IAC in Paris a couple of weeks ago. So the objectives are now science, transportation, habitation, lunar and Mars surface, and operation. So we're looking at all our capabilities and we're mapping them along these architectures and these objectives. And it's very apparent that there are some areas where we have a very big role to play. I'll mention 3. The first one is obviously remote operation. When you look at the expertise and experience and track records that Australia has in the mining industry, where most of the operations are done very remotely. When you look at the Pilbara region in Western Australia, where the mining operation takes place, they are operated from Perth. That's 2,000 kilometers away. And the mining industry has developed technologies, sensors, integrated system end-to-end using geostationary satellites. So there is a comm delay that they have also catered for. And they're operating billions of assets far away from a central location and then do that very, very safely. And we are talking, 20 assets, can be trains, it can be trucks, it can be drills, and one person is able to operate multiple assets. Compare that with Perseverance, for example, where you have one rover on the surface of an interplanetary body, and you have a team of 50 controlling this asset. So it's a complete different ratio of the number of people who are operating the asset and the asset. So looking at this capability, it's obvious that we want to be the partner of choice for remote operation in space and on the moon. So this is why we are developing a rover. We want to demonstrate that we can operate this rover very successfully from our remote operation centers. And another example is communication and positioning and navigation and timing. There is no GPS on the moon. And often in the mining areas, it's the same thing, you're GPS deprived. So what are the alternatives? And we have a lot of niche skills companies developing sensors that can give you your position and your timing in GPS deprived environment. Again, the transmission of that on the moon is key. Another example is communications. You may know that I mentioned Canberra Complex Center, so it's in ACT states. We are the only one to still see Voyager 1 and 2 because we are the only one to have a line of sight. So we're looking at the southern sky and we are able to provide communication in the southern sky that other country can't do. So there are a couple of comparative and competitive advantage there where we have a big role to play. And I mentioned earlier on the space medicine and life science. This again, in Antarctica, the teams who are there, they are cut off from the world for 9 months during the winter time. There is an Antarctica division in Tasmania where they are supporting the teams, or again, in complete isolation. We are providing remote health and remote diagnostic for these people for 9 months during the year. Again, all these supports, remote support for human can be applied for space application. And we keep discovering some very niche skills that have a direct translation to space exploration and moon exploration. And there is always a spin back, because we always say spin off, but spin back. We do things in space to improve life on Earth as well. And we are very strong in the Australian Space Agency to look into that spin back. And I'll add one last thing. Space situational awareness is one of our critical areas of priorities at the Space Agency. When we were having this meeting at the Artemis Accord meeting that NASA chaired a couple of weeks ago, we all realized that to date, there is 22 missions planned on the moon in the next 4 years, 22 missions. Can we make sure that we have like the long-term sustainability guidelines that we can apply, and that when we start exploring the moon and sending rovers and assets on the moon, can we do it in a sustainable way? And we have put our hands up to help driving framework for cislunar activity as well, and we're very passionate about that.
Yeah, I think, Aude, what really sort of struck a chord with me is how you beautifully connected Earth to space, because often the skeptics out there question the relevance of what we do in space for Earth and what we do on Earth for space. And I think Australia is a very good example, with a very young space agency and a rather dynamic roadmap, if I may say. And you talked about the Antarctic explorations, and clearly you also have other industries in Australia which will directly influence some of the technology that can be deployed for lunar exploration. And with that, I think over to you, Jatan. Could you share with us some of your perspective on this question?
Right. So from my perspective, I think one thing stands out, and I think that distinction is very important, is when we are talking about developing technologies for the moon that can be adapted to or evolved into systems for other bodies. And I'm taking the long-term view here, not 10 years, 20 years, but the entire century. So the one distinction that needs to be made is between polar regions and non-polar regions, and that too in particular in and around permanently shadowed regions. Because when we think about the conditions existing near the inside the permanently shadowed regions on the lunar poles and the areas around it. It's almost like they are two completely different worlds. So Apollo, when it went to equatorial sites on the moon, the environment was completely different as opposed to what we would face now when every country sends. So if we are able to, let's say, precision land on the lunar poles almost at will, with very few launch window constraints or something. So taking into account all of the constraints, if we are ultimately able to have precision landing on the poles at will, operate in near cryogenic or even lower temperatures inside permanently shadowed regions at scale, and the use of it is a separate discussion, but having that capability itself, we are able to do science there, drill there for maybe acquiring samples for scientific studies or other resource use, or let's say if we are able to build infrastructure like solar panels. It may seem mundane, but on the poles where the sun is always close to the horizon, it is incredibly challenging. So to generate sufficient power for activities at scale, so if we are able to do all of that, and this is just a gist of the challenges at the poles, but if you are able to do all of that at scale in the next 10 or 20 years, in some reasonable, repeatable capacity, then that environment is available at in smaller areas on Mercury, in larger areas on Ceres, in many more areas on Enceladus, Europa, and so on. So, and of course, in some cases also at Mars, but with some changes here and there with regards to the atmosphere. But the idea is that this is really like having something working at the poles is really the key to having something, some sort of a generalized solution for the solar system. Obviously, there will be many more adaptations done here and there, because it's obviously sending a lander to Enceladus is definitely not the same thing, but it's certainly along the way. So I think, yeah, that's something that I would take away from this question.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic, because what you just said, because the world is so fixated with Mars that we often forget about our other planets, the moons around those planets. So Jatan, this was a brilliant response, where you sort of reminded us that there is also other celestial bodies that we could potentially explore, and the moon could be a test bed that would allow such exploration to happen.
Right, thank you.
So let us again steer back into the realm of the legal and policy aspects. Ranjana, this is a question for you. So we all know that India has a very dramatic mission coming up, where we plan to launch humans into low Earth orbit, the Gaganyaan mission. We also have an ongoing robotic exploration relationship with the moon. However, we have not yet signed the US-led Artemis Accords. What is your view on the matter, on this matter?
Sushmita, as Stephen has just pointed out, that the Artemis Accord, which is initiated by the United States, and countries have granted accord, so to speak, to the program and to the framework that is articulated in the accord document, that represents a political understanding of the countries that are participating. Now, why has India not signed, or will India sign, is obviously a political question. And it will be a political decision which will be taken, as every government takes, after due deliberation and care and understanding all aspects of it, and then taking a call on how to proceed in the matter. So that, I think, is the only reason why you are asking me this question in the first place.
Right.
That's the best answer I can give you, but I'll try and check up and get back to you if I get a definitive answer.
Got it. So I think what you're trying to say here is that it hasn't been ruled out, but it will possibly be considered, and politically and technologically there'll be a discussion around this, and we'll have to wait and see what the eventual decision will be. So the second question, Ranjana, sort of a follow-up connected question, is, are there concerns that have been raised in India or internationally around certain aspects of the Artemis Accords Have you heard of any of these concerns, and what are your views on those concerns, if any?
There have been concerns that have been raised. As Stephen was saying, the academics have done the job mostly, and that the countries themselves have not articulated, which is fair enough. Countries will articulate only that which actually defines their best interest and what is in the long-term interest. Therefore, it's not unusual, and therefore to presume that therefore they all agree may or may not be true, and you'll have to do it case-by-case basis. Several aspects of the accords, what it contains actually, have been a cause of concern internationally. And you will find all that information in public domain, so let me not repeat it, but briefly it has to do with the interpretation of Article 2 and about this device called the deconfliction zone. Now, be that as it may, for me, I'm concerned about that which is the Artemis Accords are silent about. And for me, I will only point out there are many aspects that the Accords are silent about, even though the document itself says that they have the desire to be consistent or implement the Outer Space Treaty, which is great. So the first and foremost is Article 4. Article 4 is the one that prohibits the placement of nuclear and WMDs anywhere in outer space, which includes the moon and celestial bodies, and in specific stationing weapons of this sort. And specifically for the moon and the celestial bodies, it says that it is to be used, those planets are to be used exclusively for peaceful use and not just peaceful use. And now clearly, in my limited understanding as a lawyer, if there are two phrases being used, they must have two different meanings. So maybe we'll hear about those two different meanings in due course. The second is that there's a establishment of military bases is forbidden, as is the installation and fortification, testing of any type of vessel. So we are not just talking of nuclear and WMD, any type of weapon. So I'm thinking, not being a military person, the only other thought that comes to me is conventional weapons, maybe something special that is required for the moon, I don't know. And any kind of military maneuvers is forbidden. Now, the Artemis Accords are silent on this point. And so it raises queries on who is to be protected and from whom are we, those on the moon ultimately are to remain safe against what threat? That is the obvious question. It may have a straightforward, simple answer. The other, and relevant for our times today, is the silence on the principle of due consideration to the corresponding interest of other states. Now, this is very important. As much as Article 2 and Article 4 are the main pillars that on which we understand space as we have today. Due consideration is very important, given the fact that, Jatan has just spoke so much about India's Lunar, and you have, Shushmita, mentioned about all other countries in Asia, but there are several others that have their own programs. There are many that are penultimate to engaging in outer space, and many that will come later. They may all want to do it as per the Outer Space Treaty, even if not the Moon Agreement. What happens to them then? Why is there silence on this point? So be that as it may, there are these concerns, of course. And I also have a concern that you now have 18 or 19 countries that are the participating states that are aligned with this interpretation and these silences. That is my concern. There may be a very simple answer. I'm sure Stephen is going to give us a just straightforward, simple answer, and which I'm sure is correct. But the point is that I have concerns about it. And here, because I'm not an academic, I'm thinking about it as a lawyer.
Yeah, thanks, Ranjana. I think with that, Stephen, the ball is in your court. And would you like to respond?
Oh, thank you, Ranjana, for throwing that hot potato over to me. Well, look, I think everything that Ranjana has said is absolutely important to take into account. And if I may, Mehta, let me bring all of the discussion and the points that have been raised into what is happening at the multilateral level now, because I think that's relevant for the concerns that Ranjana, my dear friend Ranjana, has quite rightfully raised. So the possibility of the exploitation of resources on a significant scale on the lunar surface, and then ultimately perhaps bodies, is something that has captured the interest, imagination, and focus of not only industry but on a geopolitical scale. This is one of, if I may say, the big issues of space. It defines what our relationship with space is. You know, is space something simply to be exploited, or must we do it in a way that respects, as Aude says, the ongoing sustainability of space? And of course, everybody is aware of the fragility of space in issues of space debris. And if we start engaging in, I hate to use the word, but mining activities, you know, that obviously has environmental impacts. That said, the international community, industry, the civil society and governments want us to move forward and look at how we can engage in these activities. And so the important issue then is, if we are going to move forward in this way, what are the rules of the road that will allow us to move forward in a way that, if I can use a cliche, maximizes benefits, minimizes risks? Because what Ranjana is talking about is risk. You know, risks that people will do things inconsistently with the interests of others, and that leads to, you know, circumstances that we want to all avoid. And so the international community, through the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and for those that don't know, that's based in Vienna, that was established in 1959. Its legal subcommittee has the, if you like, mandate to look at legal issues and explore and try to find solutions as to how to address legal issues. It also has a scientific and technical subcommittee. The legal subcommittee has established, after a number of years of preliminary work, as you said, a working group on legal aspects of space resource activities. Now, working group doesn't mean 3 or 4 people. It means the 100+ countries who are parties to the, who are members of, excuse me, the COPOS. And I have, as you mentioned, Sumita, very kindly, I've had the honor of co-chairing that working group. And our aim, our mandate, which has been agreed by the 100 countries, and these 100 countries are everybody who's involved in space. So from large to small, and a lot of other countries as well. And it's, every decision is made on a consensus basis. So it really means everybody in the room has a voice. Our mandate is to, over the next 5 years, examine the facts, you know, what is proposed, what is likely, what is possible, what is not possible. Analyze the existing international legal framework, see where there are gaps in the legal framework, propose principles, fundamental principles that would augment the Outer Space Treaty and the other frameworks in terms of moving forward, and then decide what else needs to be done, with a view perhaps to actually formulating rules of the road. So we'll have a set of principles and then ultimately rules of the road. All of the inputs from everything we've talked about, from national agencies, from civil society, from the Artemis Accords, from the Moon Agreement, from any bilateral arrangements, from national laws that various countries play. All of those things will be inputs and are inputs into this intergovernmental process, so that in the end, we come up with principles and ultimately perhaps rules of the road that reflect in the most informed way, as I said, process moving forward. And why is that important? Because, and Ranjana hinted at this, if in the absence of that, if we start having groups of countries operating in close proximity, Jatan mentioned that there aren't that many areas of interest, people will be focused on similar areas. If we have groups of countries operating in close proximity in hazardous environments and operating in their mind's eye under different rules, then we really have the possibility of miscalculations and misunderstandings and worse, conflict. And the non-appropriation principle, Article 2 that Ranjana talked about, is there to avoid conflict and stop territorial claims, etc. And so this multilateral process that everybody has subscribed to, even in the midst of these incredibly difficult geopolitical times that we live in, we have had consensus about our mandate, about our terms of reference, about our proposed outputs, because every country realizes, in the words that Ranjana used, it's in their interest to move forward in this way, so that even in the end, down the track, if we have countries who don't necessarily like each other, and their companies, of course, because the private sector will be involved, don't necessarily like each other, may not even cooperate with each other in missions. But if they're all operating under the same rule book, whatever that rule book might look like, and they've all had the opportunity to contribute, so they've had buy-in to that rule book, then the goal is that we have a framework for these activities that, as I said, maximizes benefits, minimizes risks, because in the end, this is technically challenging, it's culturally challenging, it's economically challenging, and we have to avoid the geopolitical challenges as much as possible if we are to do this in a way that is peaceful, and as Aude says, sustainable, as Jatan says, brings back benefits to Earth, as Ranjana says, avoids military confrontations. All of those things come into this, if I may say, mulligatawny soup of elements that we have to put together. And that's what we're aiming at, the multilateral framework. And it won't be easy. And of course, there'll be posturing, and the Artemis countries will say, here's the model, we should use this. And the Moon Agreement countries will say, let's use this. And others will say, let's use this. In the end, we have to look at all of those voices and others. And then in the end, the 100+ countries will come up with whatever framework they think is appropriate. And that is the ultimate goal, I think. Back to you, Susmita.
I think that was a brilliant closing statement, I would say. I wouldn't have to add anything after this. Thank you, Stephen. We have a couple of good questions here from the audience. I know we have just 5 minutes left before we wrap up this session. So why don't I do this? I'll share both the questions with these two questions are legal questions. So I guess it's for Stephen, for you, and for Ranjana. The first question is something that I've heard not just here in the chat box, but widely in the space community, is should private entities, individuals or companies, be allowed to privately own lunar resources and or sell them? So it's access, ownership, ability to sell resources that they get from the moon. That's question number one. And the second question here is, can an organization similar to the ICAO be set up to govern activities and set up detailed standards and practices concerning mining and other activities on the moon? And this person has also added that the ICAO has 193 member states and has achieved an almost, the word here is almost, global consensus. So those are the two questions, Stephen and Ranjana. You can choose to address it in whichever order you wish. So Ranjana, do you want to go first, and then Stephen?
No, first our guest, Stephen.
Okay.
Another hot potato. You're very good at throwing that. Thanks, Ranjana. Very good questions, and thank you to those people who have raised them. As I said, in the end, it's not up to me. It's not, the question is should, what do I think? It's irrelevant, really, what I think as to whether private enterprises should be able to own. In the end, it'll be up to the member states to decide, with all of the inputs from civil society and industry. Of course, they'll have to consider a lot. what the framework should be. I should make the point that some countries have passed national law which purports to say, for example, the US in 2015 passed a national law which said, hey, if an American citizen goes up there and mines, he or she or it has the right to sell, to make profits, etc. But there's magic words even in the US legislation, subject to America's international obligations. And so everything boils back to what the international framework allows, and then that is subsumed into the national framework. Same with the Luxembourg law, which says appropriation, mining is not appropriation, but you've still got to work out the international framework. So it'll be up to the international framework. That's part of the role of what the working group is doing, analysing it. In terms of setting up a body, again, that will be up to member states. My suspicion is there are models. So for the deep seabed mining, there is the Deep Seabed Authority based in Jamaica, which now looks at applications by countries and their corporates to undertake deep sea mining. So the deep seabed is a similar legal framework to space, although I won't go into that now. And so in that case, a body was set up to, if you like, administer. Will that happen for lunar activities? Again, it's not for me to say. I have personal views, but in the end, it'll be up to the framework, the principles that the country put together. But we do have models. We have another model, the International Telecommunication Union, that manages another natural resource in space, frequency allocation, use of that, and particularly the use of it, not only, but particularly the use of it on the geostationary orbit. So we have models of organizations to administer. Whether that becomes appropriate and necessary for lunar activities, that's something that will be decided down the track. Ranjana, I throw the potato back to you.
Well, yes. In fact, everything that Stephen has said is true. So the question that arises is, of course, that the Outer Space Treaty says, establishes the principle of non-discrimination, without discrimination, to the scientific and economic development of other nations. And at this point in time, there are 11 countries that are spacefaring, of which 3 are the overspace superstars. The rest, the 8 are called middle space power. Everybody else depends on space in such a way that it is a ubiquitous presence in national and personal life. Now, when you're thinking about sharing planetary resources, which are, of course, in content different than spectrum is or the orbit is, which in any case, the ITU regulates and allows the use of it, but not the ownership of, for example, the slot, which is allocated in GSO. It does not allow the ownership, notional ownership of the spectrum, which is allocated to the country either. So yes, there is an analogy over here, but here we're talking of actually tangible, something that is going to be extracted, just like it happens on the Earth, and we have exhausted those resources, or almost exhausted those resources. The question that arises is that while this entire framework with all countries participating under the auspices of the United Nations and COPIUS and so forth, and consensus base and everything else that is good with the international organization, it depends on the conduct of the nations first and foremost, and nothing to do with condemning the organization that, it just takes too long and, it is all convoluted and it is very inefficient. We are the ones, our representatives, our countries, their conduct will tell. The 2 inimical superpowers have got the act together, despite being eyeball to eyeball, Cold War and everything else, but we have space as we understand it today. So it can be done if there is a will to be done. My question then arises is that this parallel, which is the Artemis Accords, which the Artemis program, in my, again, limited understanding, is in furtherance of the Artemis program, which is in furtherance of the laws that were already passed by the US. And we have Luxembourg also. So how and where will that vertical fit with this international understanding? I have not heard as yet any statement of any sort, including from the academic community, to say that it will finally subsume into this international. That would be extremely comforting for many countries. Those that may not at all be wanting to participate in anything lunar, but just the sense of comfort that no, what it is will remain. And all countries that are committed to it will honor their commitment. Now, as far as the ICAO is concerned, for sure, it has incredible amount of experience in civil aviation and technical standards, so forth and so forth. I don't know about what it can do for the moon, because I don't think that has been its domain, but certainly, perhaps, I don't know, Stephen, your call to take, whether space transportation, some sort of technical requirements that may be necessary for undertaking space transportation, but it's again requires a huge amount of technical inputs at this point in time. To my understanding, commercial aircrafts are flying at about 18 kilometers and military, I think, around 21 or thereabouts. So there's 82 kilometers of airspace that is not being addressed, has not been addressed really by ICAO as yet. I mean, it will require a lot of work. I'm sure it's possible though.
Thank you. I think given the world that we now inhabit, which is fairly delicate and hugely polarized, I think that was a response that we can wrap up this session with. I would like to thank all our panelists, and I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us. So we will continue this series of discussions in future similar dialogues with international partners. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Aude, Ranjana, and Jatan. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thanks, Aude.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
And I will send that email to Donna.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Take care. Stay safe.
All of you. Bye.